Please welcome back to the last panel of today, at least the last formal panel and last formal discussion. It's called Experience. It is very much connected to the previous one. We are having distinguished guests. It's Linda Farr-Darling. Then we have Nina Zupan-Zorli. And finally, we have Catherine Gorzu together with Andrew Kier-Weiss, and they will all be speaking, I suppose, about experience gained in classroom or gained in the learning process in general. Just before giving floor to Linda, let me announce once again that after this session, those ones who are interested in the theater performance called Clouds, Murky, we are moving towards the performance. There will be a small refreshment in there prepared for you. Those ones who are not registered yet and are interested, please do so right after the session, and we'll be going together with you with few groups. So if you're interested, please pick up your belongings and be at the reception right after this session. So once again, for those who have not been here yet, my name is Wojciech Rybka, and I'm in charge of the educational unit at the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes. And please now welcome Linda Farr-Darling of the University of British Columbia. Linda Farr-Darling is an associate professor in the Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy at the Faculty of Education at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. She is the first holder of the Eleanor Ricks Professor of Rural Teacher Education at this university, and she works a lot with teachers, focuses on preparing them, recruiting them, and supporting them, which especially for our educational group is very interesting. And the name of her speech is Remembrance and the Voices of Children in a Rural Canadian Community. Thank you. Please, the floor is yours.
Dobrý den. Hello. And also being Canadian, we apologize a lot. We're known for that. And because I'm, I think, the 5th or 6th Canadian to stand up here, I will say promiente. I'm sorry. We're here en masse. I'm from the western part of British Columbia, and that's way on the Pacific coast. It's a long way from here. So to give you a flavor of that, and to get back to Raphael's comments this morning about sensorial experience, I can't give you the feel or the taste or the sounds of British Columbia as easily as I can bring a few images. So Elizabeth's going to start the images right now. Thank you, Elizabeth. Research and remembrance in a rural community. The voices of children. My presentation is about students' inquiries into local history, history that's never appeared in their textbook. So, circa, this is not about grand narratives, this is about something very local. And at the heart of their explorations are interviews like this one. Wouldn't everybody be happier knowing all this happened? Asked Karen. And then let it go. Karen is Doukhobor, and Doukhobors were members of a religious community that came to Canada to start a new life after persecution in Russia, and came at the turn of the 20th century, and eventually wound up in this valley. It was a tumultuous history for them, even in Canada, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And really what Karen is asking is about her own childhood, which has been suppressed as an episode of history, She is asking, as the historian Roger Simon did, can there be a more hopeful way to live historically? Karen's memories of a childhood include a residential school. She was forced, along with several hundred other children of Doukhobors, into an assimilative project that lasted 6 years, starting when she was about 5.5 years old. She was able to see her parents once a week behind a chain-link fence. For the children, the students who heard about this, difficult knowledge, which is something they had never heard about before, became present in their lives. And so this presentation is about their impulses, first to resist or refuse it. And if you could pause just for a minute, Elizabeth, on that image. They didn't know that their town was the seat of a residential school, the site of a school where children were forced in. So although there's very many traces of Russian history on the landscape, including this old brick house, despite its presence on the landscape and despite the many children with Doukhobor backgrounds, Doukhobor history is little known to students here. As they began to study and look into a project on local history called Exploring Values of Doukhobor Community, it became clear to them that there was an underside, an underbelly to the stories they knew about the Doukhobors. In fact, most adults in the area knew that Doukhobor history was filled with suspicion and intrigue, and Gabriella Roy, a novelist, said when she first heard about Doukhobors, it was with a mix of terror, curiosity, and admiration. Elizabeth, could you pause? Here are the students on their way to their first site of inquiry into Doukhobor past. Now, most of what they had been hearing about the Doukhobors was from place names in the area. Udashinya means place of consolation. The Mir Center, which they had all been to, means place of peace. But they really didn't know about a group of Doukhobors, of faction, that had actually protested against the homeschooling of their children. Doukhobors lived communally, and they homeschooled their children, and they refused military service of any kind. And when government interference threatened their way of life in Canada, which they had started up again as farmers, a small sect, a splinter sect of Doukhobors, began to engage in civil disobedience, including burning empty schoolhouses and bombing rail lines. And it was only probably about 1% of Doukhobors, but all the Doukhobor children ended up paying for this, for the sins of their fathers and mothers, by being assimilated through this residential school experience. But these students had never heard about it, even though it happened in their town. And some of them were even of Doukhobor ancestry. It wasn't even told within families. This was a story that was shameful for many, many Doukhobors. We can keep going now. Thank you. So here the students are on their way to a Doukhobor Cultural Center. And like many people have mentioned already today, Doukhobor Cultural Centers is part of a museum that commemorates heritage. It celebrates the past. It looks at the agrarian and religious and practices of the Doukhobors, the way they dressed, their singing, their very simple ceremonies. They believed not in churches, but that God resides inside each of us. So they had very simple religious ceremonies. They lived in about 10 families to a house, very big houses. And this museum really commemorates the traditions, the traditional crafts, the embroidery, and also the history of one of their spiritual leaders, Peter Verrigan, who led them across Western Canada to settle in British Columbia. The students interpreted these stories in a lot of ways, and they also spoke with people at the Cultural Center about the traditional handcrafts, and little by little stories began to leak out about the elders' past and their childhoods, which had been in residential school. The students became a little more immersed in the history. They found out about the long march the Doukhobors had taken across the Rocky Mountains from the prairies of Canada, where they first settled, to British Columbia. And they were tasked with producing 11 short films with the guidance of professional filmmakers on Doukhobor life. Many of the younger students, and this is very interesting in terms of how we take up history, how children and youth take up history. Many of the younger children, grades 7, 8, 13, and 14-year-olds, concentrated in their films, and these are images from their films that you'll see. They would concentrate on the facts that they had learned through the museum experience, and they would concentrate on the field trips and the descriptive narrative of what they found. And although it's a little dark here, this is the memorial for Peter Verrigan. Other children, also some of the younger ones, concentrated on traditional foods that the Doukhobors ate. So one film was all about the making of borscht. And borscht has today a very significant part of Doukhobor life, as it did 100 years ago. And you can see Doukhobors sitting down to bowls of beaten cabbage soup. For these students who took up these memories, they evoked a kind of imaginative identification with their own rural lives, what Roger Simon called remembrance as continuity and confirmation. These were rural kids they could identify. Other students took the idea of imaginative identification a little further and actually photoshopped themselves into archival photographs of the Doukhobors, as if it were some kind of exciting homesteading venture, instead of really what was leaving their homeland and having to start new lives under the motto of toil and a peaceful life. Some of the slightly older children, grade 9, grade 10, began to look at the values and the qualities Doukhobors lived with, including their generosity to the Japanese Canadians who were also interned during World War II. And the Doukhobors, because they refused to be part of military of any kind, some of the students, who were actually sons and daughters of war resistors themselves in the area, were very captivated by the Doukhobor burning of arms, which happened in Tsarist Russia in the 1890s, one of the first mass public protests against being conscripted that we know about. And many of the students looked and reinterpreted the solidarity of the Doukhobors, particularly the women who really ran the farms often. The men ran sawmills and jam factories. These were a self-sustaining group. And many of the students were quite captivated by the stories of the generosity of the Doukhobors and just the peaceful ways in which they lived. They were vegetarians, and they hooked themselves to plows. They did not use oxen. They did not use horses typically. Once in a while they used horses on wagons, but not to plow. So students who, as I said, came from farming communities were really taken by that. What happened was the ground really shifted once the interviews started to take place at length, and there were multiple sessions. Nobody ever asked us before about what it was like to be Doukhobor, says Peter. And having the students come and ask us, said Irene, made me feel better about who I am and where I am, following this history that's never been talked about in this town, that for 6 years I was in a residential school. Their stories of brutality, beatings, if they spoke Russian, they were beaten or couldn't eat. Packages, care packages from their parents never arrived. And through the painful stories of Doukhobor elders told to youth who were hearing them for the first time, remembrance became a practice of discontinuity and unsettlement. That's what Roger Simon calls it, when troubling knowledge is confronted and students don't quite know what to do with it. It unsettles. Some of the students understood that there was a lot of history they couldn't make sense of, but they did a film about a residential school survivor who started hiding when she was 6. and was caught when she was 8. And over several sessions that lasted over several months, Kathleen finally said to them, everything that happened in your life made you the way you are. So I don't know, do you change it? Another group of students even found one of the original teachers in the residential school, who still stuck to her former views and said, I think we should do whatever we can to educate our children to fit into a larger world. It was for their own good they went to residential school. So these are some of the images of the students, and this is behind the chain-linked fence, the students waiting for their bi-weekly visit from their mother, which could last 20 minutes between them and the chain-link fence. For these students, this was deeply upsetting, and many of them railed against the injustice of it and were very angered by it. And others looked for something that was their own relationships to loss in their lives, and began to feel the disruptive touch of memories that were not theirs, what Levine calls dwelling in a vicarious past. It was clear that other students were listening for an uplifting message or silver linings in the elders' stories of social violence. The students decided to bring the stories into public space, into the civic sphere, into a town hall. And this is where I'm ending the presentation. It was standing room only, a teacher said. People who gathered to hear children tell the stories of children, echoes of memories that went back 60 years. And it was filled with many poignant moments. And the last images here, because we are running out of time, are the children telling the voices, in their own voices, the stories of the Doukhobor children. And for the first time, these stories became part of the public record, part of the story that this community tells about itself. So it became a public pedagogy of remembrance, as in Roger Simon's words. And the last images, which are going to appear on the screen, just take us back to what history education can do. And this was just a start, just an opening. For one of the elders, it was even a sort of healing. And I don't want to overplay that. It was just a beginning and just an opening. But that's how I like to see it. It was a hopeful opening and a crack in the wall to more understanding and more compassionate ways of living with one another. So this kind of past cannot be repeated. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Darling. May we now, I think you have raised a number of issues, starting with the forms of education, previous ones and new ones, home education and so on, revival of some community and different forms of bringing this public remembering to school, but let's follow the order and discuss that just by the end. So the next, the title of the next presentation is Holocaust Survivors, Accounts in the Classroom, the play Who Returned My Soul as a Bridge Between School and Memory. And it's going to be presented by two colleagues. Catherine Gorzuch, founder and artistic creative director of the Foundation for Holocaust Education Projects, and Andrew Kier Weiss, associate professor of history and chair at the Department of History and Political Science at Demon College. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm Andrew Wise, obviously. This is Catherine to my right. I'm going to start the presentation talking a little bit about some of the theoretical framework within which we can understand the real value of what's going on with Catherine's foundation. So I guess I need to get a clicker. So what we're talking about today is a play that was written in 2007 by Kelly Brock, a playwright who wrote the play for her master's thesis. And Catherine will talk more about the process in just a few moments, but from the beginning, this was really an attempt to get students engaged in the process of learning about this particular topic in history. The play was written with students in mind, and it's been produced by students on several occasions, and Catherine will talk about this, and we'll see some examples in a few moments. I think it's important to note at the beginning, and Catherine might have a couple of comments right now, about the process by which the play came into being. It's an interesting play, really consisting of 10 monologues, each from a separate survivor, and Avi Mizrahi, who can't be here today, is Catherine's partner in the foundation, and he has this to say about what the survivors intended to come out of this play, that of course their story will go on long after their passing, and unfortunately one of the survivors has passed since the play was originally written and produced. Catherine, could you speak a little bit about the interview process and the way it came into being?
I would be delighted to. It is a pleasure to be here, everyone. Thank you. We met Holocaust survivors because they were docents at the Miami Holocaust Memorial on Miami Beach, a beautiful location, an outdoor memorial that was originally intended as a memorial. The survivors became involved and were encouraged by Avi Mizrahi to tell their stories to students, to anyone that would come by, and for years they did that. I had the pleasure to visit, and then I became a volunteer all the way from Texas. And the more we heard their stories and we heard their messages, we realized that what would happen when the day came that they could no longer be at the memorial to share. So we contacted, actually I was contacted by a friend. We saw a play that led me to Kelly Brock, who was the producer of that play, and we instantly knew that she might be able to craft their stories into a play. We gave her this challenge. She delightedly accepted, and several months later, she came to the memorial and within 2 days interviewed 10 Holocaust survivors, from Shabbat dinners to afternoons at the memorial to their homes, anywhere we could squeeze in time. And she spent hours and hours recording their messages. She took them home and then crafted the play for Avi's approval.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about Holocaust plays in general and the way in which they've been analyzed. There are some 250 plays have been written and produced as of the late 90s about the Holocaust. What's different in this case, almost unique, is that it was very intentionally set about interviewing survivors in a particular framework, and again, very intentionally targeting students to be actors, not just the audience for this particular play. Robert Sklar is one of the major writers on Holocaust drama, and he says that playwrights who want to focus on the Holocaust typically have these 5 different criteria that they keep in mind: paying homage, educating the audiences, inducing empathetic responses, raising difficult moral and ethical questions, and asking us to think about the historical lessons that can be derived. We see all of these 5 criteria in the play written by Kelly Brock. I think, however, what's really interesting about the play beyond those components is the way that there is really a 6th goal that was set about. The foundation that Catherine's talking about is one that works in coordination with another foundation in Buffalo founded by Norman Weinberg. And Norman Weinberg has, in many ways, tried to promote historical preservation, for example, preserving several dozen Jewish cemeteries in Poland, promoting Holocaust education in Poland, and in this context, promoting Holocaust education in the US. What we see in this play, and we'll see some examples in just a few moments, is that the students become immersed, they want to learn more, and they want to become real preservers of these memories themselves. So, Catherine mentioned Kelly a few moments ago, and if you have a few more comments you want to make, I'm going to slide some of her words by.
Okay, thank you. Well, Kelly decided, so we gave her this challenge, this task of recording these stories that are vibrant and hours long, to craft them into a series of 10 monologues, about 10 minutes each, so that they can be separated and used in the classroom as a teaching tool, or in the theater by professionals, by communities, and certainly, as we hoped, most importantly, to the school communities. And that's exactly what she did. By creating a reader's theater style, the students no longer, or in this case, did not have to worry about memorizing the script, which allowed them, as Andrew said, to become immersed in the stories. It was very exciting, and the students used the word responsibility within this.
Yes, and I think one of the interesting components of the play and the whole process of its creation is that Kelly Brock, the playwright, took into account this difficult relationship between history and memory. And she introduced this interesting device of a historian, a character who stands outside of the monologues themselves, provides a sort of historical context and linkages between the separate monologues. As Catherine implied, they can be read individually or in several groups or all 10 at a time. There was no attempt on her part to artificially connect them, have characters, for example, interact in ways that weren't historically there. The historian provides that connection. And I think the role of the historian in the play, that character, has a particular task of providing a historical context that really generates this interesting dynamic between memory and the schoolroom environment. So let me just add a couple of comments here before we see some examples of this play in action, talk a little more about some of the outcomes that have been noticed among the students. One woman who's been very active in using drama to teach about the Holocaust is Valerie Zotman, and she's written several articles about it. It's her contention that drama provides, as the quote here tells us, a particular attribute for dealing with these particular issues that are involved in studying the Holocaust. So this was the whole nexus again of drama and history, which in this particular case, this play written by Kelly Brock, has had a powerful impact on the students involved. Catherine, would you like to talk a little bit about the sort of the timeline we're talking about?
Thank you again. In July 2008, Kelly, in July 2007, Kelly set out to write the play, gave us our first draft, and again, Avi Mizrahi, who knew all of the survivors and their stories intimately, had to approve everything that she said, that she couldn't add or change their stories for the ease of the play. She had to be accurate within their stories. It was workshopped several times in Detroit, and then finally it made its premiere in Waynesboro, Virginia, a town where I am from, to much acclaim and applause. Survivors had just started visiting the town a year or so before, so the students had some knowledge of their stories, and they were so excited to tell their stories. Quickly it evolved to November 2012, and several times before this, again, to workshop and work on the play. And we offered it at the Shenandoah Valley Holocaust Project, a Holocaust Remembrance Week. And then it was performed in Florida in front of all 10 survivors. That was just an incredible experience for the actors and for the survivors themselves. For the first time, they were hearing someone else tell their story in their words.
And just to reiterate here, that this performance, and this is something that Norman, our mutual friend and sort of the sponsor of this particular project, and this is how I got involved because Norman lives in Buffalo. He's a snowbird though. He goes to Florida in the winter, and that's where the foundation is. So this is how Catherine and I sort of became connected to this project. Over 50 students took part in that particular production. Grades 7 to 12, say they were the actors, they wrote original music, they were also the director, and here's a couple of stills from that production. The young man, I say he's an 8th grader, on the right, gives you sort of an example of the care and detail that these students took as they produced the play 6 times, 5 times for a general audience and once for the students. On the left, you could probably guess this is a young woman who was actually the director of the play. So all components in that particular production, and again with audiences that were sizable over a full week, And Catherine, were you there at the production?
I was there for the opening night, and it was wonderful. Holocaust survivors were in the first 2 rows, and I believe they just kept interrupting with applause.
And we'll see some scenes of the actual survivors who are who provide the monologues with some of the actors and actresses that played them. Before we get to that, though, I just do want to add, and Catherine can elaborate on this, that the play has been translated into Polish, French, and
so far, Polish, German, and Hebrew, and it's being translated into French with a collaborative effort between France and the United States this year.
And it has been produced in Poland, as you can see from this slide here. Here are a couple of stills from this. Once again, student produced. And in this particular shot, you can see how the contextualization of the play, which is done primarily by the historian who provides that linkage, sometimes done with the visuals, as in this case, from this production in Poland. Neither of us were at this production. Catherine, where did it take place? What's the building?
It's a restored synagogue in Poland. 2 standing ovations, I might say.
So before we get to some students talking about, I'll give you some quotes from students who talk about how this whole process of being in the play engaged them in further learning about the Holocaust, but also, I think, further introspection about other problems in society that they've seen. We had a lot of different clips of students to show you. We're just going to show you 3 clips in just a moment. But our general conclusions, again, based on these various productions, is that active student engagement through the dramatic reading or full-blown production of this play really paid dividends in terms of students becoming fully invested in learning more about this particular historical topic, students getting engaged with the interesting dynamic between memory and history, and from our perspective, it really bridges some of these problems that we see, clearing the gap, closing the gap between traditional history and the engagement of the broader public in teaching students about this particular historical episode. So I think this is the time to cue for our other slideshow. Perfect, this is great. So Catherine prepared, and she can perhaps talk about this while you're reading the accounts by the students who were engaged in some of these performances.
Great, so these are 2 of the students who performed in Wilson High School, and not only have they performed, they've competed, they have toured this play in the Valley. We sat with them in this last spring after their 2nd year of doing this and asked if they had anything they'd like to share with us. And we were not surprised to hear how grateful they were to have the stories and feel responsible for the survivors' experiences. We were delighted to hear them make links between the issues of bullying and current genocides today. And one young gentleman, a 10th grader, I believe Michael is on the next slide, he explains how he was chosen to play the part of Isaac. Isaac was a Mengele twin. Michael is also a twin, and that was not done on purpose. So when Michael learned, he started to study more on his own. We did not ask him to, and he makes the comments that in learning, he studied the Holocaust already. He knows how to take an exam, but this play helped him truly understand and identify with them.
This is still his quote here.
Yes, thank you.
And that went by. And I think with the time remaining, we'd like to show, I think we have time to show a brief video clip that Catherine has pulled from many different accounts. So I think we can cue it up. Thank you.
And the fragments from the shell sliced my arm. It was bleeding so badly. Imagine a 10-year-old boy wounded by a bomb. The people on the bus helped me stop the bleeding.
I'll tell you how we met.
Make sure you tell it right.
Would you just let me tell the story?
You haven't even started telling it yet.
That's because you're interrupting me.
Okay, tell the story.
Okay. Let me see. We met when we were working in a factory during the war.
You'll need to start at the beginning or they won't understand.
Would you just let me tell the story?
There were 109 of us in one car. My father had us stand by the little window. There was one bucket of water and one bucket for sanitation purposes. We were lucky to be under the window because when it rained, we could put our hands out between the barbed wires and catch rain on our fingers. We were on the train for 4 days. Eventually, though, we could hear a woman screaming and crying in the car next to us. Day and night she screamed. Eventually, we realized it was my sister. She thought she had lost one of her children, but her child was with us. Papa was given some bread.
Eat, Auntie.
But, Papa, you need to eat too.
Who says I'm not eating?
Then he would pretend to chew the bread, but I knew he wasn't really eating.
Well, this is a technical difficulty.
Could you explain it a little bit?
I'm happy to. This is Anne Rosenhack, who was the survivor whose story you just heard, and the young actress who portrayed her story.
Right on cue.
Right on cue.
That's it for us. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for this profoundly dialogical presentation. And let me please give floor to Nina Zupan-Sorli. Nina is from the Slovenian Study Center for National Reconciliation, but also Konference School Center for Technical Sciences. And she has a number of experience with school competitions and working with especially secondary school students. The title of her speech is A Different Approach in History Teaching, Grandpa, Tell Me a Story. So please.
Thank you. So ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is lovely to be here. Thanks to all the organizers. It's a really lovely conference. And I'm sure that you are all fit enough to listen to this final contribution of the day. It was a long day, but very fruitful one, I hope. So, yeah, I would like to share with you my personal experience of working with students, my students dealing with controversial issues and combining different methods. So the title is Grandpa, Tell Me a Story. As a secondary school teacher, I have been aware of the fact that history education in the past in many societies was perceived as a dogma. The misuse of history education was very common in the recent past, in the authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. Myths and stereotypes have quite often formed the topics of history textbooks. Controversial issues have not been dealt with because they could spoil a desired image of the past. People identified as different have usually not been represented or have been depicted as enemies. In 2006, Euroclio, European Association of History Teachers, made a European research which showed great interest of teachers, academic historians, media, politicians, civil society, and also religious institutions and parents regarding the role, significance, and position of history as a school subject. One of the most important goals of history education has been helping young people to understand the present. History teachers always wonder how to discuss sensitive issues like crimes of totalitarian regimes. And sensitive topics could be very divisive, emotionally very stressful, and bias strengthening. So there is always fear and risk that dealing with these topics in the educational process in the classroom would open old wounds and start dividing people again, in that case our pupils, our students. So, on the other hand, controversial and sensitive topics are a very useful tool which enables students and pupils to understand the basic nature of history as a science. Because almost every historical event, process, personality could be interpreted differently. And the truth is not revealed by itself. History does not exist until it is created. Human life is constantly changing, and within this process, history and knowledge about the past have been changing as well. Every generation reveals different history and asks different questions. I encourage my students, they are all between 14 and 18 years old. They are students of secondary school, mostly boys. So I encourage them to put questions on the past to their parents, grandparents, relatives, neighbors, uncles, etc. So in cooperation with the Study Center of National Reconciliation, my students and I practice collection and analysis of oral history of the 20th century. By using this method, students are able to experience and look at the everyday lives of ordinary people. Students get information on people that are usually not spoken about. Collecting of oral history offers the story which is sometimes missing when we speak about historical processes and events. So, different points of view are compared. Students are able to practice the key historical concepts like continuity and change, chronology and narrative, causation, and develop some key historical skills like formulating relevant questions, examining historical issues, evaluation of sources, structuring of information, critical analysis, and reaching some conclusions. So, by collecting family stories, unique threads between past and present are created. In 2012, in cooperation with the Study Center for National Reconciliation, my students made a short film on forcibly mobilized Slovenians into the German army during the Second World War. Students interviewed some of the survival ex-soldiers, one of them is on the picture, and they found out new facts for discussion. And they also did analysis and interpretation. The film was shown at the commemoration for all victims of authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. So, German mobilization is a controversial and sensitive issue which has not been much discussed in Slovenian society, although between 50 to 60,000 of young Slovenians were forced to join the German army in the Second World War. Many of them were killed at the battlefields around all Europe. In fact, in many parts of Slovenia, there almost isn't a family that wasn't touched by this. Almost every family had its relatives in the German army. Forcibly mobilized Slovenians were sent to the German training camps in different parts of Austria. Soon after, most of them were sent to the first front lines. Many of them fought in battlefields of Poland, the Soviet Union, Norway, Greece, France, and Italy. Soldiers had to struggle with very tough living conditions. Many men were injured and around 10,000 were killed. Since July 1943, the Slovenian soldiers have been forbidden to take holidays because a lot of them did not return to their units. Lots of forcibly mobilized were captured by the Allies, and many of them escaped and fought against the Third Reich and its allies. Some of them stayed in the Red Army units too. Then after the Second World War, the mobilized men returned back from prisoners' camps, and those that were captured by the Red Army returned only after a few years. But back home, they were interrogated. They were called the Schwabisch soldiers. Their fate was decided by the revolutionary communists, and their human rights have been violated. In 1992, they were given the status of victims of war violence. So in 1952, the first associations of forcibly mobilized Slovenians have been established. And the main association cooperated in making this film, which I would like to show you in a few seconds at the end of this presentation. So in fact, this will be just a short insert of the film, 2 minutes. But let me tell you a few words on the content. Excuse me, Elizabeth, could you? No, just, sorry. Back to the presentation, yes, please. So, my student Peter finds his uncle's letter in the drawer, dating in the year 1943. This is the last letter he wrote from the Eastern Front, where he was forcibly mobilized by the German army. And soon after that, the German command announces that the boy was killed in the battlefield of Ukraine. They announced that to his family. My students are very interested in discovering what happened to their grandfathers and the others during the Second World War. So together they travel to the Museum of Contemporary History in Ljubljana, where they are shown the collection of testimonies of men who were forcibly mobilized. The clothes of mobilized soldiers are also on display in the museum. That was shown in that picture at the back. So, later on they get more information at the Institute of Contemporary History. They listen to an expert speaking on life of forcibly mobilized Slovenians in the German army during the Second World War. Finally, they look for surviving recruits who are willing to share their own stories and explaining how they miraculously survived this terrible war. Together they go to the cemetery in Kranj to visit a monument in memory of Slovenians who died for a foreign army in foreign countries. Young people are able to feel the suffering of the boys who were almost the same age and whole absurdity of war. Now let me show you the film. Elizabeth, please. Thank you for your attention.
I would like to thank all the 4 presenters for enlightening the last session with actually moving pictures, which I liked. And may I ask now the audience, the people, for questions? I have a number of my own questions, but it's your conference rather than mine. Sirka Ahonen.
Just can't resist temptation to ask about history. It's not about.
Yeah, I have one question about Slovenia in case. I just wanted to ask.
Pardon. May you give the question just after Sirka Ahonen? Sorry, I was not able to direct the microphone in the right direction.
The historical context of these mobilized soldiers. Were there any, let's say, voluntary soldiers fighting for the Germans? I'm referring now to the Croatian Ustašas, and is this diametrically different? The predicament of these soldiers. Sorry.
Yeah, we were talking about forced mobilization, so they were forced. They were not willingly.
Not, I mean these soldiers, but in Slovenia altogether, were there any?
Yeah, they were also voluntary soldiers.
Okay, that's what I wanted.
Ukulamber, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, thank you very much. I had basically the same question, so I wonder if I could rephrase it somehow now. I wonder just about the same issue. How reconciliatory is this kind of recognition in Slovenian society? Because I do have a sense that that it's very political, and this voluntary versus forced is often a matter of interpretation as well. Right? How open-ended is this kind of interpretation?
From my experience, because my pupils, my students, bring me stories. I give them tasks to question their relatives. They often go to their grandfathers. Or just 1 week ago, one student brought me a story about his neighbor, and he said, I had to really put an effort to get this story because the man didn't want, he almost couldn't speak about it. It was such a difficult issue for him. So his neighbor was telling him the story of forced mobilization. So I get a lot of stories like this. So I think in general it really was a forced mobilization that it was not talked about. It was put somewhere behind collective memory. It was really almost forgotten. And now it's coming, and it's painful. It's very painful for the nation. Because they were suffering double way. First in German army, then at home. And their families were suffering because they were suffering. They couldn't speak about it. So that is really a question of somewhere deep in our hearts this has to be healed if we want to progress. It's a very, multi-layered thing. I couldn't answer in a few minutes. It's a long debate.
Next question, please. We have space for 3 of them.
question to Linda. Really am fascinated by what you do about the Duhobor community. My question is, what is the current state of the community? Do they still live where they used to live? How many people still kind of associate themselves with that community? Are there any efforts now to revive like the feeling of community? And what was the origin of these people? From which parts of the Soviet, or if it was not that of the Russian Empire, did they come from?
Well, I answer the first part of your question, which was which was what has happened to the Dukhobor community since. Most of them have considered themselves as Dukhobor independents. They don't live in communities anymore. They live more assimilated into mainstream society. And there's about 40,000 people that identify as Dukhobor in terms of ancestry now. But in practicing Dukhobors, it's under 10,000, at least in Canada. There's some just south of the border in Washington State and Idaho, and a bit in Montana. I think but they're generally living not communal lives. The height of their prosperity in Canada was in the 20s and 30s, and before World War II. And with World War II and Canada's involvement in World War II, there was a lot of negative backlash against the war resistors at that stage. So a lot of people didn't identify as Dukhobors after that. So it really dispersed the communities at that stage. My understanding is they came from all over Russia, but it was Leo Tolstoy who pleaded their case and helped them get to Canada, and was able to raise money for them to come on several ships. Actually, I think there were in all just under 9,000 people who came. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. If I got it right, first that's Magdalena Chris first, then the lady in front of her, and then there was someone on the left, third one, I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. You've presented in this panel 3 very intense experiences for the students, very powerful examples. And I'm wondering, well, on the other hand, other research on sort of everyday normal history teaching in schools shows that it's quite a non-intense experience for students. So I'm wondering, what do you think is the role of such intense experiences, I think that's what the panel's called, in history education in general, overall?
Should I ask Bradley?
I think from my perspective, what we've seen with the play, and a lot of this is secondhand, I've been there for a couple of productions at the college, but Catherine could probably elaborate, is that the context as well. So that's sort of what I see coming out of this moment of intensity.
And if I might add to that, while the moments are intense, the stories are incredibly intense. We ask the survivors to give the students and the next generations a message, if they have one, and each one did. There were stories like love one another, be kind, other not more powerful, but very different messages. And as the students studied the lives of the survivors, they actually studied them and got to know them and called them and wrote them letters and Skyped with survivors and Skyped with people who knew survivors. And that was really an incredible experience for all of them. So while it was a very intense experience, they got to know them over months of time. And I think that makes a very big difference. When you are performing a play, a tremendous experience like the diary of Anne Frank. We worked with children who did that, and we surprised them with a survivor. Actually, it was Number of the Stars. And the survivor saw the intent of the students, and she, for the first time, took off her Star of David and gave it to the child, if you know the story. If you don't, see me after. And for the first time in 60 years, she took off her Star of David and gave it to those children. That was an intense moment, but the intent was to understand the significance. Those children bonded with that experience in ways I can't express. They have gone on to do incredible things in their lives, and I would say that it was the meeting the survivor and getting to know them, however they did that, which made the most significance to them. And I hope that answered your question, not so long-windedly.
Just to follow up, of course, part of the goal of the project is to maintain the possibility for that intense engagement through the production of the play after survivors pass away. And of course, that's one of the things that happened in the midst of the Damon production. One of the students reading one of the parts learned that the survivor had passed away, and it dawned on them the reality of what the project was about, which was to make sure that those intense connections with survivors that Catherine spoke about, and that, you know, is often a component of Holocaust education in the States, at least, that won't be there in a decade or so. But this type of play perhaps will allow that intensity to continue in future educational environments.
Thank you. The question was to all of you, so may you follow up, Linda, please?
I would just add that it seems to me that a common thread amongst these three presentations is the power of relationships. Relationships with the past that get built, and relationships with people of other generations who have messages to deliver and to communicate, and they want those to be heard, and they want those stories to be heard. So I think perhaps the intensity of the moment you probably couldn't keep up over a year of being in a classroom with students. But I think the intensity of those relationships that get built over time, none of these were one-offs. They were all continuous, growing relationships with these people and these stories. And I think that's what persists.
Thank you. Nina, anything to add up?
You have all said it so beautifully. So no, really. Yes, I think that this social component also is really important between grandchildren, grandparents. They really do enjoy it once they see how nice it is. They say, I talked with my grandfather for the first time about such a subject. Maybe we will do it again. So I think this is really important, that they start to enjoy history. That's what we want to achieve, like, yeah, that's the goal.
Thank you. Next question, you, and then Carla.
My name is Lisa Krieg from the Department of Cultural Anthropology in Utrecht, Netherlands. I have two questions for Catherine and Andrew. The first one is, I would like to know more about the framework of your project, like were the students, was it part of an obligatory history class at school, or were the students a group of volunteers? And the second question connects with Felicitas' question. You talked a lot about all the positive effects of this intensity of the project, and I was wondering if there were also a bit more rebellious reactions of students, or students who started retreating because of this intensity. Thank you.
I can only answer part of this because I've only been connected peripherally to the productions at the college, and it was actually, the production was supervised by the theater department. So these were volunteers who, I don't even think they were taking a class, but Chris Brandis, whose name is on the program, couldn't attend. So it was really not part of a history class. But what happened was that students began to engage more in the story that before this they had not really studied with much intensity or with a great deal of curiosity, frankly. For the rest of your question, I'll let Catherine.
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. I cannot think of a time that this was a required performance. all of the students they auditioned and they volunteered, and some asked to play a part, and some were chosen. Like I gave the example of the young man who was a twin, ultimately playing a twin. As far as students retreating from the experience, I think that there was only a moment of time when there was a young woman whose grandfather was passing away, and she had, through the experience of telling her family around him during a Shabbat dinner, during a Passover dinner, and she learned that he was a Holocaust survivor. And that was a very emotional experience for her. As you can tell, it's a bit emotional for me because she told me shortly after, and she didn't know his story. She was just told that information and just had to sit with that for a little while. He passed away, and she came, we were very fortunate that she came to us, and we've been trying to find his story through the beautiful help of the Holocaust Memorial in Washington, D.C. But all other experiences from classrooms, from other students wanting to come and know more. This is even developed, as Andrew and I were talking, to try to create a Holocaust elective course within the school and then provide it to other schools. It has offered teachers who work with the play to go on to Holocaust-related and other genocide-related workshops to try to learn more about the subject.
Thank you very much. Question from Karina Horini, and the last one from, yeah, Karina Horini, please.
Thank you very much for presentations, which were very inspiring, but now when we have time for discussion, I would like to go a bit into a methodology of your work. I had the feeling that what your projects have in common is that it's centered around the stories of victims of some oppressed groups. And I would like to know, how do you work with this aspect in also in your work with the students, that you know that we are presenting a very specific point of view on the historical events from a very specific group of people. So, are you operating in a field of action research, or is some aim of your work giving a voice to specific groups? Or I think or I can imagine the context, especially of Slovenia, because I would like to know that you've said that the debate about this historical event is very complicated in Slovenia, and you are presenting one specific point of view on the topic. So how do you, is it a goal, or do you put into your work also another voices of from society? But this question is probably centered to all the presenters, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think that the most important thing is that some voices were very much heard for, I don't know, 50 years in Slovenia. There was only one side of the story. We know a lot of that voices, and it's the right thing that we do know. But now it's the time when the other voices that weren't heard should step forward and also be heard. We shouldn't say no to them. They also have the right to be heard, to be spoken of. That's my point. And I also do that in classroom, both sides. The problem is that, you know, pupils, when they come, still don't know about it. Because there always isn't enough time for our national history, like we said before in the first panel or the second panel. We always know about everything about the Greeks, classical history, but we always have so little time for our national history. That's the case in Slovenia. So yeah, that's the problem, because that's on us teachers to change, but it takes time. And the government, of course. I mean, yeah, that's what those conferences are about, so that we speak about it. That's the first step.
Thank you. Would you follow up with your answers?
I think in the case of the Doukhobor children, it is very contentious as to whether or not the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were justified in punishing the actions of the Sons of Freedom, who were the ones that engaged in a lot of civil disobedience and actually ended up ruining a lot of property in their efforts to articulate what their position was with regard to homeschooling and refusing military service. So there's a lot of controversy that we were able to actually delve into with archival records and newspaper accounts. And even amongst the Doukhobor community, it's quite controversial as to whether the Sons of Freedom, as they were called, had any justification at all for their actions. So even in the public record, there's a lot of debate. So that was pretty easy to find. And amongst the elders, there was a real split that came into the stories about the children who weren't the children of the Sons of Freedom, of this extremist group, but were Doukhobor children paying the price of someone else's civil disobedience. So Peter's gone through some of this too, and I see your hand is up, Peter. Was that what you were going to?
Just to get in line.
Oh, okay. So there was a lot of opportunity. This was a term-long study, so that's about 13 weeks. And the students wanted to carry it over into a second term. So, so there was lots of opportunity to see what happened on the other side, the government's position. The government has never formally apologized. There's been a couple of human rights tribunals about these cases, and there's been regret expressed, but not a formal apology. So that's still a matter of some debate as well as to whether these people, before their passing, will receive some kind of apology from the government about what happened to them as young children. So that would be my answer to that.
Thank you.
I'll just a quick word about contextualization of the production. I think that was part of the question too, and I think that is something that Catherine's foundation, and I know to what extent I've been working with it. That's what we would envision too, is that the production of the play, which is of course idiosyncratic in a fashion because you have 10 survivors' accounts bonded together by the role of the historian. To further contextualize that would be, the goal, whether that's in a formal setting or whatever. I would just add the caveat here that we did do a bit of that at the production, and it didn't work too well because one of the speaker came on and talked. He really threw a wet blanket on the whole affair, frankly, because he spoke about memoirs and memories and inconsistencies in memories and so forth in a very generic way, and the power of the dramatic moment, frankly, and the power of the student engagement, I think, was a bit diminished or potentially diminished, and this is some of the feedback I got, and this was at the college. I don't think that's been done elsewhere, but I wouldn't advocate that again. Further contextualization to be sure, but not at the moment, I think.
Thank you for interesting answers. I have prepared some concluding remarks, but if you wouldn't mind, I would rather give floor to last 2 questions. We have a couple more minutes. Last 3 questions. Last 2 questions. Okay, so first was Jaroslav Pinkas, and then you, please.
Tak, děkuji za slovo, jmenuji se Jaroslav Pinkas a já bych měl takovou kritickou poznámku možná ke všem přednášejícím. Velmi se mi všechny prezentované projekty líbily, jsou úžasně propracované. Myslím si, že dali hodně jak řešitelům, tak studentům, tak těm pamětníkům, kteří se zúčastnili. Ale silnou stránku těchto projektů já osobně vidím spíše v nějakém rozměru, řekněme, společenském, nebo sociálním, nebo aktivistickém. A zdá se mi, že to samotné téma paměti tady jde trošku stranou, protože já mám zkušenost s podobnými projekty, koneckonců podobné projekty se rozvíjí po celé střední Evropě, v českých zemích také. A ta moje zkušenost je taková, že ti studenti přejímají ten pamětnický narrativ vlastně nekriticky a do značné míry vlastně se ta paměť stává spíše nástrojem nějakého politického aktivismu nebo rozvoje sociální empatie. A to, co mě třeba schází, tak je ten problém kritického přístupu k paměti, který se tak trochu tady v tom typu projektu vytrácí. Takže jenom otázka zase vlastně, možná se tady přede mnou už někdo ptal, jestli jste si tohoto rizika vědomi. Je to zase otázka asi na všechny.
Thank you. So we might reverse the order and start with Nina. Or if someone else is ready to answer, please do so.
Just to clarify the question, my thing wasn't working, but the question's about was there a critical approach taken in this process? Because the foundation and the focus was on empathy, is that correct?
But it was for all, so you can, yeah, so go ahead.
Well, I guess I could just perhaps mention what I mentioned in response to the last question, that we did try to sort of contextualize this within a critical framework. We'll do more of that in the future, at least through what productions we might do at Damon. But when we tried to do that at the moment of the performance, it didn't work very well. It frankly sort of was two different dynamics, two different imperatives. And I think cast within a broader framework of a semester or a module, however you want to frame that, that's certainly a great idea. And I would advocate contextualizing it at the college level, at least within some other critical analyses. But when it was done at the time of the performance, it really didn't work well. We had other historians in the audience. Our guest from Poland, for example, was there, and he thought it was a horrific idea. It was my idea. It didn't work out very well, so that's why I'm very self-critical about trying to pair a performance with commentary, perhaps of a more critical nature, side by side. Over a course of a module or a semester, sure. That's something I would definitely like to do at the college environment, but paired in the same evening didn't work well.
Maybe I can rephrase the question because I'm not sure whether you have met the intent in here. I think the question was going in this direction. Rather than learning, offering the students opportunity to learn to approach memory in a critical, independent way, this might tend to not force them, but make them identify with certain particular memory, and the pedagogical goals are not that clear to my colleague. So, would you like to follow up, or is that?
No, I think it's still in the working. Yeah, in terms of the pedagogical imperatives, at least at the college level, the production of the play was done on a volunteer basis outside of a history classroom environment. So, if I were to play a role in conjunction with the theatrical performance, there would probably be some other imperatives, just to rephrase what I said.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to follow up?
Just very briefly, I'm understanding that this is really a question about the fragility and the frailty of memory, and about the ways in which memory acts in terms of the interactions with these students. And I think in the case of the Doukhobors, so many perspectives came out as a result of the interviews. The sessions were multiple and many different people from many different sides of the issue were interviewed. So the residential school teacher, for instance, was interviewed. And what I got from the students whom I talked to was that many of them started to realize that trying to reconcile the past and trying to put this together in a tidy piece would be impossible. And that really the task was to communicate as faithfully as they could the stories that they heard, knowing all the while that the truth they were getting to was partial and fluid and only partly the entire story. I do think that for some of the older children, some of the youth came through. I think for the younger children, no, I don't think there was much of a critical framework there. And that's something I think we can work on in history education. Thank you.
Thanks, Nina. Would you like to respond shortly?
Yeah. So when we discuss in the classroom about the stories they made, we always put these stories in the historical context. So I think that the main goal is to reach empathy through this critical approach, I would say.
Thank you. One last question by Stefan Levesque, short one and pointed just to one speaker this time.
Okay, it'll be short and pointed. The question is for Catherine and Andrew. As you were talking about the power of the play as an educational tool for Holocaust education, I wonder if you knew of or came across the Heart of Auschwitz project, which is at the Holocaust Memorial Center in Montreal, which is a production, an artistic production that came out of a little book in the shape of a heart that was given to a Holocaust survivor in 1944 while she was at Auschwitz, and she was able to keep and preserve that little book for the time she was at Auschwitz, but she kept it after. And it's this story of this little book that is followed by students who do an inquiry project and then do an art piece out of it and give it back to the lady who is now 85-year-old. So it's available. It's a DVD, but it's also a project at the Holocaust Memorial Center in Montreal.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
I would like to come and see the production. Thank you.
Thank you very much for an open, critical, fruitful, I hope, debate at the final session of today's part of the conference. Please be welcome to today's theater performance called Murky. I hope it will be another opportunity to hold discussion either on today's sessions and a number of topics that came out and were not possible to be discussed during the sessions, or a discussion on the play Clouds Murky itself, because I hope it somehow fits to our topics. I would like to use this opportunity also to thank some people, because part of the audience is going to not to come tomorrow, as far as I know. So first, next week, as part of the accompanying program, there will be a workshop for teachers, students, and the rest of the world on documentary films. We have held, or actually PhD students of the Faculty of Arts of Charles University have held 4 such workshops, or actually 3 up till now, and a discussion with current Czech writers that deal with memory. I would like to thank them, and I would definitely like to thank the organizational team with Eva at the first place. Thank you.